a great joy to be here and talk about this topic of the Lord's Day. Many of you probably know that the Archdiocesan Synod this year, its theme is the parents as the primary educators of our children in the faith. And one of the things that Archbishop Hebda has been very keen on is the importance of the Lord's Day as an important kind of reclaiming in this area, certainly for families, but also for every individual. So in this talk, I want to do two simple things. One is, I want to talk about that you and I are in great need of the Lord's Day. This is not an extrinsic commandment. This is something that captures the fundamental need of humanity. And if we don't take the Lord's Day as a kind of an important part of it, we will see, as I will see, and I hope to show you, that some difficult things start to happen. So one is the fundamental need. The second thing I want to do is get practical. What does it look like? If I take the Lord's Day seriously, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? So the first part of the talk on need, that comes from me. The second part of the talk comes from my wife, who's very practical. Like many of you women know, she gets practical, and a lot of it is, certainly we've done it together, but she has been informing. So first, why do we need the Lord's Day? Let me give you a thesis. Every academic likes a thesis, and here's my thesis. If you and I do not get Sunday right, we will not get Monday right. If you and I then do not also get leisure right, we're not going to get our work right. These are not two separate realities, but two realities that are related to each other. And so this is the title of the talk, is this idea of a defense of leisure, the importance of leisure in its relationship to the Lord's Day. So leisure calls for a defense because there are certain forces in our culture that's making this idea of leisure and the Lord's Day more difficult. Let me highlight two. I would call them crises. They're difficult crises, they're complex crises, but they're important crises. And the first crisis has to do with mental health. And we are dealing with a mental health crisis. And there's a growing chorus of voices speaking about the increasing rates of loneliness, lack of meaning, sadness and despair, especially among our young, but also for the general population. There are lots of reasons for mental illness, and I want to be clear that I can't get to all the reasons in a talk like this. But I think a lot of it, or some of it certainly, I think a lot of it has a lot to do with this idea of leisure. So what's been the challenge, particularly among the Gen Zs here, those between about 14 and 25, there has been a disproportionate high rates of the following among Gen Zers than other generations: depression, anxiety, psychological disease, loneliness, sleep deprivation, physical isolation, less face-to-face time, pessimism about our own situation in the countries, suicidal thoughts and actions, and a kind of overall inner fragility. The data is astounding. There's so much to talk about, but let me just highlight a couple of them. Between 2011 and 2021, the number of teens and young adults with clinical depression more than doubled. 42% of all Gen Zers battle with depression and feelings of hopelessness and loneliness, almost twice as high as Americans who are over 25. And 5 times more 10 to 14-year-old girls were admitted to emergency room for self-harm in 2023 compared to 2009. There's other issues here of what we call deaths of despair from drug and alcohol overdose. And here's the question that a lot of people are asking: why the increase and why now? Again, lots of debates over this. But there is a very interesting psychologist. Her name is Jean Twenge, and she's from San Diego State University, who's been doing a lot of writing about this. And then many of you probably know a guy, who you may have heard of, a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. And those two have been kind of working together in a very interesting way. And she wrote a book called The iGen, and she's been following these trends. What's happening? And when I read something that she wrote, I was astounded. And what she said is that she thinks that the relationship between the decline in mental health, particularly among young people, but not just young people, also other people, has a lot to do with leisure. And she uses the word leisure, which I thought was really interesting that a psychologist would hold on to that word. And so here's what she says. She says, I didn't come to that conclusion, the correlation between this relationship of mental health and leisure, immediately or lightly. I came to that conclusion because nothing else fits. In some ways, it was a process of elimination. If you consider what affected Gen Zers versus millennials, which is the generation just after them or before them, one of the biggest differences is the shift in how young people spend their leisure time. And this is increasingly for older people as well. And of course, you know how young people and other people are spending their leisure time. It's through screens. It doesn't take much to notice that. And I see it all over the place at my university. Right now I'm teaching a course with the dean of our engineering program called The Mission of the Engineer. And so we talk a lot about work, but in there I do my thesis. If we don't get leisure right, we won't get work right. And I have to tell you, the discussions on leisure are powerful. Because what I will ask them is saying, what do you do when you have a free moment? Leisure. What do you do when you have a free moment? Right? And you all know what they do. The screen. It's the default mechanism. It's where they go. And that's how a lot of us do it now. When I got free time, I go for that screen. And then I say, and of course, what do they do on that screen? Well, all sorts of different things. Netflix, obviously, TikTok, Instagram, social media, a lot of sports, plays, whatever it might be, right? And then I ask them, so how do you feel after you've finished that free time? Not great. Guilt. Here's the interesting thing. Their free time should give them rest. And what do they feel? Restless, anxiety, a kind of like, that was a waste of time. And then, of course, I ask the opposite question, like I do often. Well, why do you do it? Right? It's kind of habit. And it's a habit of what we might call an addiction, because that's why you do things that you don't like over and over and over again, even though you get some initial kind of hits of dopamine or whatever it might be. And much of it has to do with the idea of FOMO. You know the word FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. I have a colleague, John Boyle, who says, we need not FOMO, we need JOMO, the joy of missing out. Right? And so these screens grab us. And by the way, they're designed to grab you. There are economic incentives to grab you, right? And they grab us. And they've done something to the way we deal with leisure. And the reason why all these rates have gone up, all the increases, because when young people, particularly from ages 10 to 16, their brains are developing a particular way, and it impacts them in a much fiercer way than those whose brains have been developed. But it still impacts those who are older in a particular kind of way. So this raises a really interesting question. What is leisure? What should leisure do for us? And what kind of leisure helps us to flourish? And then what kind of leisure causes us to decline? And so this crisis, this mental health crisis, at least from Gene Twenge, has been a serious problem. But I actually think it's also related to another crisis that's distinct but related. And it's a crisis of what we might call a moral and spiritual crisis. And what's interesting is that it's particularly related to this term called acedia, which is, by the way, and this goes back all the way back to the early church, to the monks, to the desert fathers, the Middle Ages. They call acedia the vice or sin against leisure. Right? So this is not a new problem. This is a very old human problem because it's the way we're hardwired. And it's very interesting of what people have said about this idea of acedia. And by the way, acedia is often translated as sloth. But Yves Lanois, the great Catholic novelist, English Catholic novelist, said this. He said, acedia is the besetting, the troubling, the overwhelming sin of the modern age. There's something about the modern age that has made this a particular kind of problem, right? And a very famous philosopher by the name of Søren Kierkegaard said that acedia is an intellectual and spiritual laziness that involves the despairing refusal to be oneself. Right? Because we think of it, when you think about the word sloth, acedia often is sloth, we think of physical laziness. But the tradition has never equated it simply with physical laziness. That could be a symptom of it. It's more of a spiritual laziness. And this has lots of symptoms. The one symptom is, I think, would be whatever. Doesn't matter. The whatever attitude, comes out all the time. And it's interesting that the whatever attitude is it's the loss of faith in the power to generate and to build and to do something great. And this is a problem in our culture right now, particularly among the young who are increasingly opting out of institutions. They're not getting married, they're opting out of church, they're not volunteering, they have no interest in politics, right? And they think that their fulfillment will come from their own particular individual lives, and thus they escape institutions, right? That often leads as a form of acedia. Although, by the way, it's not just that. Joseph Pieper, who I'll get to in a little bit, will often said that acedia is also found in workaholics. Those who work and are interested in only work, but nothing but work. Because their identity is found in an activity that they get to define, and they self-define themselves. In fact, that picture, I hate to tell you, is from the University of St. Thomas. It's a statue in Minneapolis called the Entrepreneur, the Self-Made Man. That's also a form of acedia. And so these symptoms we need to be mindful of, but we have to get to the root of acedia. And that comes from my namesake of my university, Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas puts it this way. He says, acedia is a sin against the Sabbath, against a soul resting in God. The deep moral and spiritual crisis is found in this refusal to rest in God. And so these two crises, both the mental health as well as the moral and spiritual crisis, tells us that we have to convert. A conversion of mind. We have to think differently. How do I think differently? And then when I can think differently, then I can act differently. So let me just say a few words about these two forms of conversion. In fact, I think there's no better person to get at the mental issue about how we can think, than a man named Joseph Pieper in a book that he wrote called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And he wrote that book in 1947. And here are some of the things he said about it. He says, leisure is an attitude of the mind, the condition of the soul, to what? To receive the reality of the world. Leisure is not golf. Leisure is not out there. Leisure is a power of the soul. That power to receive others, to receive God, to receive the world, right? It's a way of letting the work world go by. It's a way of saying, letting go of our worry and our anxiety. To do what? To receive the essence of things. To see things that we haven't quite seen before. So first, receptivity. Pieper then goes on to say, leisure is not the attitude of the one who intervenes, but of the one who opens himself, not of the one who seizes, but of the one who lets go, who lets himself go. And boy, do we have a hard time letting ourselves go, right? We hold on to our kind of narrow, sometimes small lives. And leisure is this kind of letting go. And thirdly, Pieper says, leisure has been and always will be the first foundation of any culture. Key word there, culture. It comes from a Latin word, cultus. We don't like the word cult, but cult is what you worship. At the heart of leisure is this idea of worship. It's a religious claim that connects us to the deepest of all realities, rather than the superficiality of reality. So, I could go on a little bit more about what Pieper says about this, but it gives you a flavor. But I have to point out something which is really interesting. Joseph Pieper is a German philosopher. He lives in Germany. He wrote the book in 1947. I don't know any of you know your history, but in 1947 in Germany, Germany has been absolutely devastated, obliterated. We carpet bombed Germany. The Soviets from one side, the Allies from the other, and Germany lies in waste. Churches and schools and hospitals and businesses are all flattened by the bombs that we laid on it. And the philosopher comes out and says, I'd like to talk about leisure. Can we talk about leisure now? I mean, my goodness, right? This guy is just that darn academic who sits in the proverbial academic tower who has no clue about what reality is. This is what you would think. Well, Pieper knew that people would say this. And here's on the first page of the book, Pieper says this: to build our house, to build our country, our institutions, our economy, he says, at this time implies not only securing survival, but also putting in order again our entire moral and intellectual heritage. And before any detailed plans along these lines can succeed, our new beginning, our refoundation, calls immediately for what? A defense of leisure. Why would he say a defense of leisure? Joseph Pieper was very much aware that over the concentration camps in Germany, such as Auschwitz, was a German phrase. It was right over the gates. Arbeit macht frei. Work will set you free. And Joseph Pieper knew that work will not set you free. Work will marry you to ideologies, whether it is Nazism, communism, or to be quite frank, American capitalism. Work is not enough in our lives. Work will not save us, but will destroy us by itself, as important as it is. And he was getting at something deep that's in our modern culture. Because we live in a culture that basically has the primacy of the active over the contemplative. This is all over our educational system. Certainly, even at my university, we are so fixated on the career, right? Education is increasingly justified only to get the instrumental value to occur. Why do I learn? To basically get a job. Well, by the way, let me be very clear. You do learn to get a job, but you should never learn to only get a job. Right? In fact, often my students will say to me, like Dr. Naughton, why do I got to take theology? Like, why do I have to take art? Right? And the first thing I say to them is, stop saying like, right? By the way, we all have filler. I got my filler, right? We have to learn to get the filler out of there. So I do that because I love them, not to critique them, right? But then I say to them, I said, well, did you know, I said, that the very word leisure comes from a Latin word and a Greek word, which means schola, which is where we get the word school. And you at school are at leisure. I don't think so, Dr. Naughton. I don't think so. School's not, it's not leisure for me, right? But that's something gets at a particular challenge, right? But nonetheless, we have been fed what they call American pragmatism in our educational system. It's all about being pragmatic. And Pope Benedict XVI had a very interesting insight on this. He says, the pragmatist views reality essentially from a functional point of view. He no longer approaches the world from the viewpoint of contemplation and wonder, but as one who measures, weighs, and acts. Right? There's something, by the way, let me be very clear. It's good to be practical. It's good to have a good career. I taught in the business school for 20 years. I don't want my kids coming back living in my basement, right? I want them to go out and work and to be independent. All of those things are very important, but they're necessary but insufficient to a full life. And so if we can think differently, then we can begin to act differently. And it's in this acting that I want to go to, these idea of habits. What do habits of leisure look like? Let me highlight 3 of them. The first is the habit of solitude and of silence. Take the earbuds out. In fact, we listen to, usually, not all, but most people, particularly young people, listen to way too much music. And what it does is it often overstimulates the emotions, right? Which causes a high degree of sentimentality. We need silence. And by the way, not just silence out there, but silence in here. I don't know about you, but I got these tapes going on in my head all the time. I am the unappreciated genius at the University of St. Thomas, right? If they would just listen to me, I can really tell you how I'm going to run this university. I walk to school. I walk about 2.5 miles to school, and I have these debates with my colleagues that I don't particularly care for at St. Thomas. I won't tell you who they are, right? And by the way, I win every debate. I never lose. And these tapes are going on and on and on and on. And you know what? It's preventing me from hearing what I really need to hear. I create a false self. These tapes are creating a false self of who I think I am versus who I actually am. And it's in the silence that we can then begin to hear God's word speak to our hearts about who we actually are. Silence. It is a powerful habit of leisure. Second habit is the habit of celebration and worship. And I will talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. But this idea, and by the way, welcome back. Great to have you back, right? It's about celebrating. And by the way, I know many of you probably know Kool and the Gang. Every wedding has celebration, right? And it goes on this crazy little line, says, what's your pleasure? That's what we're going to celebrate. That doesn't lead to celebration. That just leads to a lot of nihilism, right? Celebration is this radical affirmation that the world is good, not because I say it or think it, but because it really is good. That's why we celebrate weddings. That's why we celebrate deaths. Because in death is not the last word. Right? And so this idea of celebration and its relationship to worship, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. And thirdly, the habit of fraternity, the school of charity. This may seem like an odd form of leisure, but I think it's an important one, because if you think about when Jesus got in trouble with the Pharisees, it tended to be over the Sabbath. And what did he do on the Sabbath? He healed. Leisure is a great time to be, not to just simply do things, but to be with the poor, to be with the lonely, to be with the marginalized, right? And in that way, they will give us things that no one else can. So these three habits, I think, are crucial to our lives. And yet, they're hard. And a lot of us have spent a lot of time avoiding them. I did for many years. I came to St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota in 1991. I got a tenure track position there. And I had a new job. And in the next 10 years, I had to get tenure. I was traveling a lot. We were starting this program called Catholic Studies. I had 5 kids. And I made a major financial decision a few years before that. I married my wife, who had the same amount of debt as I did. So I was heavily indebted, right? It was, by the way, the best decision in my life, but it was a terrible financial decision, right? And so we had to buy a house that was dilapidated. First month, the roof was leaking, the basement flooded, everything was going wrong, right? And my schedule to keep things up for about 10 years, and by the way, we didn't have phones at the time. I had a big legal pad from Monday to Sunday, 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., half-hour increments, all in one page of all the things I needed to do. That schedule, after 10 years, started to have cracks in it, serious cracks in it. And it created some real strains. It created the strains in the marriage. By the way, I thought I was a very patient man until I had kids, and I realized how impatient I really was, right? And I started to get this kind of depression, particularly on Sundays. And by the way, I found out later that there's a psychological disease named for it. It's called Sunday neurosis. It's a Hungarian psychologist, Sándor Ferenczi, who coined the term. And of course, the question is, why do people tend to get depressed on Sundays? Now, of course, you might say because they're going to go work on Monday. But actually, I think it's because people try to rest, they don't know how to rest, and they get themselves in knots. And so all of this came to a crashing moment. Is in 1999, I got a sabbatical. I got my tenure, I got a sabbatical, but I had to give a talk in San Francisco. And I had a major anxiety attack right before the talk. And believe me, I kept on saying to myself, no, you can do it. Just do it. Do it. And my breath was running out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't catch my breath. When I was talking, I just couldn't do it. And it was the worst talk I ever gave in my life. I thought I was ready to run. I was ready to run out. I was ready even to collapse. But it was a terrible, terrible talk. And while it was a terrible talk, it was the best talk of my life, because it made me confront things. And this is all the thing about what happens with suffering. Suffering often makes us to confront the superficial lies we find ourselves in. And what made me confront is that I was doing all the work, and I wasn't allowing the Lord to work on me, right? Because I was scheduled from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., even on Sundays, to get the work done. And it came very clear to me that I needed this. Matter of fact, it was a combination of both the mental health crisis I faced with an anxiety attack, and then the moral and spiritual crisis that I was failing to confront in how I was living my life. And this is why the Lord's Day is of such crucial importance. And so if you don't mind, I would like to do then is just move to the more practical questions about, well, what does a Lord's Day look like? And the first thing we have to realize, the Lord's Day is not an hour. It's not the Lord's Day. It's not a Lord's hour. It's a Lord's Day. And that is not an easy thing for us. That's a lot to give up a whole day. But it is what the Lord is asking, because he's asking us to do two major things, to live Sunday in a radically different way than the other 6 days. First is to give yourself rest, because we are made for rest, and to give him praise, because we are made to praise, right? And so worship and rest are the two key things here. And by the way, let me be very clear. I'm looking at all of you out there. I see some of the older people with myself, some of the younger families, young kids. There's no one formula here. Everyone has to kind of wrestle with this on their own. But there are principles, and there are ways of thinking about it that should cause us to act in different ways. So let me look to the more practical dimensions. The first is preparation. We always, when we value something, we prepare it. And preparation can come in a lot of different forms. One is, my wife will often put on Wednesday in her calendar, Lord's Day. Just a way to think about what might we do in the Lord's Day on that day. And the key thing in preparation, by the way, has a lot to do with Saturday. How you spend Saturday is going to have massive influence about how you spend Sunday, right? I, for example, don't take Saturdays off anymore. I work, because I can't get all my work done in 5 days. So I need 6 days. Now that might be a problem in itself, but it is something that I just simply say I'm going to work, and particularly not only my only academic work, but also homework or housework and things of that sort. And certainly for those of us who might be finding ourselves spending way too much time on a screen, drinking way too much on a Saturday night, Sunday is going to be a disaster. What you do on Saturday will have a lot to do with how you will do things on Sunday. Because for a lot of us, because we take Saturday off or don't do anything, Sunday becomes the mop-up day. So preparation is of crucial importance. Second thing is tech fast. I mentioned at the beginning of the whole idea of mental health, right? Turn off the phone. By the way, it's good for the phone. Your phone will work a lot better when you turn it off. Right? It's the reason why the phone doesn't always work that well. And if you can't turn off the phone owns you and you don't own it. Right? This is why the Jews always, and the phone's not bad. I have a phone, it does a lot of great things for me. But the Jews said we are not going to work or consume on Sundays, not because work and consumption was bad, but they don't own us. And we have to be detached. We have to find a form of detachment, because in the detachment, when we come back to it, then we can order it better. And the same thing with our technology. There's a huge debate going on right now in our culture. And we are today in a much better place than we were 5 years ago. Because 5 years ago, we weren't having this discussion. But most people are recognizing that these phones that we have are powerful, important instruments that can do serious damage over the long term. And if we don't find ways to put them away, they will do damage to us. Tech fast, important. Entering the Lord's Day in silence. Although as I look at you with small children, that's a hard one. Right? Because they get up at 5:30 in the morning and it's not like I can enter the day in silence. But for those of us who are a bit older and the kids who might, and then of course when they get older, they like to sleep late. So that becomes a little easier too. But it's like entering a cathedral. When you enter a cathedral, you enter it in what? Hush. We should enter Sunday in this hush, in a silence, and let that silence roll over us. I can't tell you how important silence is. In fact, if you have the handouts, go to the last page, and I have a series of quotes on silence. They are all so beautiful. This could just be by itself a meditation on Sunday morning on silence. Pope Benedict, if you look at the second one, Pope Benedict, only if it is born from the silence of contemplation can our words have some value and usefulness and not resemble the inflated discourse of the world that seek the consensus of public opinion. Oh my goodness. Because what's coming through our phones is a flood of information. We are more informed by more things than any other generation in the world. The amount of information we have coming in is of extraordinary capacity. And yet we're starving for wisdom. Silence can give us that wisdom. Mother Teresa, who, by the way, is just an amazing woman in terms of the deep, simple insight, says this, the second quote, "We need to find God, and God cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is the friend of silence. The more we receive in silent prayer, the more we can give in our active life. We need silence to be able to touch souls. The essential thing is not what we say, but what God says to us and through us. All our words will be useless unless they come from within. Words which do not give the light of Christ increase the darkness." And there's so much to be said there. But also to enter into the Lord's Day in ritual, in prayer. And if you look to page 2, my wife and I, and particularly my wife, I shouldn't say my wife and I, my wife, right? She had a wonderful, and she actually borrowed this a lot from Christ Redeemer, which really takes the Lord's Day very seriously. And we just adapted it for ourselves. And so we light a candle on Sunday and we say this morning prayer together. And then if the day hasn't gone if the day's gone very well, we end with another prayer. And by the way, that's the other thing of ritualizing Sunday. We have an oil lamp and we put it on the kitchen table with a runner on it. And that's when we light that. That's the only time we light that candle throughout the week. And we say this prayer, ritualizing it. Sabbath walk, get out of the house, get into nature. The fathers of the church spoke of nature as God's second book of Revelation, right? We sometimes think that all reality is what's in that screen. We need to say that's no, we have to get out of the screen, but also get out of the house. Take a walk, a Sabbath walk. And obviously at the heart of Sunday is the Mass. The Source and Summit, I see it's even in your missalettes, the Source and Summit, which is a beautiful thing. And here is the reason why the Mass is so important is so many reasons. But it gives us the real presence of Christ. Because it's really hard. This is the problem of a technological world. It's really hard to see the presence of Christ in the world. The Mass gives us the presence of Christ that then helps us to see the presence of Christ in everything we do. It's very interesting, by the way, at the gifts, at the offertory, what do we bring up? We bring up bread and wine, but we also brought up all the money that was collected. And what is that money is? That money is your work. And that Work is being offered so that we can then begin to see of Christ in the workplace. The presence of Christ is found, once we see it here, we begin to see it in the world. And here's the key thing for many of our families. It's time to have a feast. It's time to brunch. It doesn't have to be fancy, right? But it's a time to dine. And we Americans have a hard time dining. We tend to feed, not dine. Actually, I'm going to Italy to teach in Rome next semester. It'll be my 7th semester in Rome. And the Italians got real problems, by the way. Let me be very clear about that. But they know some things that we much better than we do, and they know how to dine. In fact, they're always amazed by Americans, because what do? We put all the food on the plate, we mix it all up, we eat it, and we're done in 20 minutes. Right? And the kids, and this is the thing I was always noticing about all the kids, they want to go. That's not how the Italians dine. One food at a time, 5 courses. It's a couple of hours. And what do? They talk, they converse, right? This is relationships. Sunday is a day to build relationships. And we need to build it over food. It's key. And have fun. Games. My wife has a whole closet of games. We play games after we eat. And by the way, if I was to do it all over again, now I got grandkids, so I have to make sure I do this with the grandkids. And I don't, by the way. Remember I talked about technological fasting? A nag fast. No nagging. You got 6 days to nag your kids. Kids, how about it? Wouldn't it be nice? One day, come on, give me one day off. Right? Let's make it a day of fun. And then give it to them on Monday. Right? Because they deserve it too, right? And the reason why we do this is we want to form our children, but we overdo it all the time. And lastly, charity, right? The corporal works of mercy. People in retirement homes, people in soup kitchens, the lonely neighbor, the lonely person at church, to reach out. And by the way, maybe even for those of us who are older, our own siblings, who we prefer not to talk to sometimes. And just make Sunday that time for the call, right? These are the ways that we can spend Sundays. And what do these things do? They produce great fruit. The first fruit is, particularly for those of us who are married, it strengthens our marriage. It helps us to remember, right? I mean, my wife and I, we've had some moments. And Sunday helps me to remember that she is the greatest gift God has given me. Right? But sometimes that's hard to remember. But Sunday can help with that, right? Because it's true. We suffer from amnesia. Sunday is a time of memory, to remember who we are and who we've been created to be. It also strengthens parent and family relationships, because you're having relationships. You're having meals with them. You're playing games with them. And yes, watching a football game is great, but if you can play football, it's even better. Matter of fact, I have 2 boys, and actually the girls too, and we had a bunch of families. And on Sunday afternoon, we went and played football together. Some of the greatest memories that we have. And all of those, and here I would particularly emphasize the importance of the father. For the father to protect Sunday. Women tend to have an intuition for it. But we men, we need to step up, because there's a patrimony for us to protect, and it's our families. And you don't have often a lot of time for it. Every moment's crucial. Right? It also strengthens our faith and particularly our identity. I will say sometimes I think my major identity is being a professor. I like being a professor. I like people when they call me a professor. But it's a very dangerous place to be, right? Or whether you're a CEO, or whether you're a doctor, or whether you're a lawyer, whatever it is, that's not our primary identity. Our primary identity is found in our primary institutions. It's found in our families, of being a father, a husband, a brother, a son. And it's also found in the church, that you and I are created as children of God. That is where our deepest identity, and it's where Sunday is constantly reminding us of that, right? And all of these things will bless our week with graces. And this is an insight that I really am so indebted to my wife for. Because what she was helping me see is that when we live this day rightly, the way that we begin to look at our week is different. For example, at St. Thomas, we have lots of politics at the university. And believe me, I get way too involved and way too absorbed in those politics, right? Now, when Sunday's there, it tempers that. It shows me that those are not the things that should run our relationships, even though I still got to deal with them. And so this is what Sunday can do for us. And so let me begin to wrap up with this more practical thing. If you did an audit, what would be at the center part of Sunday? Would it be worship, or would it be something else? And particularly our amusements. Our amusements usually get the best of us. We spend way too much time on amusing, and we lose sight of some of these other things. I often say that if I treated adultery like I treat the Lord's Day, I'd be in big trouble. Honey, I tried it this week, that adultery thing, but I didn't quite work out. I'll try it next week, okay? That ain't going to do well for your marriage. The Sabbath is part of the Big Ten. The Lord put it there for a particular reason, because this rest is of such crucial importance. And so let me end with a few questions. Where do you spend most of your leisure time? Do your leisure activities give you rest? What are the challenges you face on Sunday? And what creative ways can you and do you reclaim the Lord's Day? So thank you very much. I think we'll go far.